share a few thoughts with you. The world, but especially this country, every region, and every state in this great nation is in the midst of an unprecedented demographic transformation. The kinds of changes we find ourselves in the midst of, you're going to have to buckle your seatbelt to deal with them. And if you ignore them at your own peril. There are lots of things you can debate today politically. Demography is not one of them. If you're 5 years old today, 5 years from now, you're going to be 10 years old. Comes the same time every year. You just add one to what it was last year. Every year I go in, I have to go on Friday for my annual review with my dean. And I'm going to walk in on Friday and say, you know, I was 59 last year. I'm 60 this year. It's called forecasting. Get a big raise every year. The kinds of changes, we call them disruptive demographic changes, and in the time allotted me, I want to talk about the linguistic diversity challenges that undergird that whole notion. I don't know why this isn't working. Do I have to point this someplace? Maybe turn it on. That might help. How do I do that? On the side. Hey, turn green like money. Okay, I want to talk about what the big trends are, this whole notion of immigration-driven linguistic diversity, and then there are a few key takeaways. I'm going to talk about that. I usually talk about 6 big disruptive trends. I'm just going to list them. I'm going to focus on 3 of them today. The kinds of trends we find ourselves in the midst of, one of them is the browning of America. The second one is marrying out is in. The third one is the South rises again. The fourth one is the silver tsunami is about to hit. The fifth one, the end of men. Some of you may have seen the book. We don't have time to talk about it today, but we'll get back to it. My last one is Cooling Water from Grandma's Well and Grandpa's too. Maybe in the discussion we can talk about those. I'm going to talk about the first 3 because I think that those are the 3 that undergird the discussion, the wonderful discussion we had earlier, and that you all will have for the next couple of days. The browning of America. We're in the midst of a profound change in the racial and ethnic complexion of our society, and it is all rooted in our immigration history. I've got to give it to you quickly. These are cartograms where we've exaggerated the size and shapes of foreign countries proportional to the number of legal immigrants we've invited to America. 3 panels, 1921 to 1960, 1960 to 86, 1987 to 1998. Look, if you will, at the top panel in this graphic, what you will see between 1921 and 1960, most of the legal immigrants we invited to America came from where? Europe. Most of them came from Europe. Relatively few came from Asia, and a smaller share from Latin America compared to Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, that was an intentional immigration pattern because until the mid-1960s, we had an immigration law in America that said if we were going to allow the foreign-born to come to this country, it was important that they not upset the existing racial and ethnic balance of our country. So we had an express preference for people who were phenotypically similar to Anglo-Saxons. People could come to America, learn to speak English, anglicize their names, and this thing called a melting pot was supposed to work. In other words, we operated on a quota system that was geographically discriminatory against people from most regions of the world. Go back to the 1880s, we had something called a Chinese exclusion law. They shouldn't be allowed to come to America because it would be, quote unquote, difficult for them to assimilate. Fast forward to the first decade of the 20th century, we identified something called the Asiatic Barrier Region that included Japan. Shouldn't be allowed to come to America because it would be, quote unquote, difficult to assimilate. So we control the composition of our population through our immigration law. Fast forward to the second panel of this graph, you see something interesting begin to occur. What you will notice in that second panel is that immigration from Europe shrinks relative to the earlier period. What begins to grow? Asia assumes greater importance, and Latin America grows even bigger. This is a profound kind of shift that occurred in 1965 via an amendment in our immigration law called the Hart-Celler Act of that year. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a profound piece of legislation that undergirds the entire discussion that we're having today. The Hart-Celler law, in essence, eliminated those discriminatory provisions based on geographic origin, opening up the doors of our country to people who heretofore had not been allowed to come. Opening up the doors of our country to a group of people who were phenotypically different from Anglo-Saxons, people who could come to America, yes, they could assimilate, to do all those things, but you always know that they're different. Why? Because they're phenotypically different from the Anglo-Saxon model. Fast forward to the third panel, this graphic, what you will see, immigration from Europe almost disappears. The majority of immigrants since the mid-1960s are largely from Asia and Latin America and the Middle East. This 1965 legislation is so important, we draw a dividing line. Anybody arriving Prior to 1965, we called the old immigrants and the so-called invisible minorities. Anybody arriving since 1965, we call the new immigrants and the visible minorities. So takeaway number one, undergirding the browning of America, fundamental shift in geographic origin. Takeaway number two, fundamental shift in phenotype. Takeaway number three, the numbers changed dramatically across those periods. Between 1920 and 1960, we only allowed about 206,000 legal immigrants to enter the country annually. You see between the 60s and the early 2000s, somewhere between 500,000 and about 880,000, and since 2005, about 1.1 million annually, all contributing to the growing diversity of our population. Mid-1960s, we acknowledged for the first time that we were a nation of immigrants, so people who were being persecuted in their homelands for economic, political, religious reasons. Refugees, parolees, asylees, we opened the doors of our country to them too. You see the numbers fluctuate depending on the conditions around the world, including natural disasters. We open our door, but all of those people contribute to the growing diversity of our population. Not much controversy here. It's when you move here, when people begin to get their rear ends out of joint, when you start talking about illegal immigration. Now, prior to 1965, illegal immigration wasn't much of a problem in America for two reasons. The Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. You ever met anybody try to swim either one of those bodies and arrive to you? Wasn't much of a problem. But after 1965, contiguous border, open border, until recently, how many? 300,000 to 400,000 people entering the country annually over the last 2 or 3 decades. The current debate about illegal immigration in this country is not new. In the 1980s, when I was on the faculty at UCLA in California, lots of debate about we got too many illegal immigrants in America. We need to do something to stem the tide of illegal immigration. At that time, the federal government says, well, maybe if we saturate labor demand, fill every job in our economy, illegal immigrants will have no reason to come. How do we propose to do that? Via something called the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, we said to any unauthorized or illegal immigrant in America that if you've been here illegally, you can document that you've been here illegally since 1982, we will grant you amnesty, no questions asked. Well, how do you document that you've been here illegally? Well, you got a rent receipt, a clothing bill, a greasy receipt from Burger King, say I bought a Happy Meal, whatever you buy from Burger King. So we'll grant you amnesty. How many people came forward? About 3 million people came forward to accept amnesty, all contributing to the growing diversity of our population. And then understand that once they accepted amnesty, they could bring family members via the family provision, so the numbers were actually bigger than that. But there were about 2.7 million people here illegally who didn't trust the federal government enough to come forward. They said, oh no, I'm not going for the okie-doke. You ain't gonna identify me and then deport me. But they didn't go home either, they stayed. So by 1996, we estimated about 5 million illegal immigrants in the country. And since 2005, that number has ranged anywhere between 7 million and about 15 million. Now, I have high regard for Judith Rizzo. She's a good friend of mine, so I had to bring my A game today. So I stayed up all night last night figuring, trying to come up with some number, some figure, some ballpark figure. So this is hot off the press. How many illegal immigrants in America? A lot. The real number is about 11.5 million people. Now, who becomes the poster child for illegal immigration in America? When you hear this debate, who is it? Some person of Mexican descent, right? Suggest to you, and many of you probably know this, a little bit more complicated than that. Are you aware that there are a group of immigrants in America called non-immigrants? Well, let's look at them. Non-immigrants are people we invite to America on a temporary basis. There are about 68 different categories of these people. Tourists, international students, foreign diplomats, and international baseball players all come on visas. Ladies and gentlemen, if you come on a 90-day tourist visa and you stay 91 days, what are you? No, you're called a visa overstayer. About 40 to 45% of the illegal immigrants in America, ladies and gentlemen, walk through the door with papers from the federal government. When it's time to go home, what do? They stay. Look at the numbers. Grew from about 11.8 million in 1981 to right before 9/11, about 32.8 million people dropped after 9/11, but you see the numbers are all the way back up now. My message to you, ladies and gentlemen, we're not having an honest discussion in America about illegal immigration. We're scapegoating a group of people who come and want to work hard every day and take care of their families. If you're worried about homeland security and the like, it's probably these folks. You know why? Because they come from all over the world. No offense, they look a lot like the people in this room. In fact, I don't know who in here is illegal. I'm going to find out before I leave. Let's have an honest discussion about illegal immigration. We're not having it now. It's far more complicated. My message is you see that takeoff 40 million people today in the country, real sharp increase after we liberalized our immigration laws in the mid-1960s. Who are these people? About 47% of them are Hispanic. The second largest group, about 25%, are Asian. You see non-Hispanic whites only account for about 19%. Remember, prior to 1965, the immigrant gateway was what? Ellis Island. Today we got so many gateways we can't even put a lock on all those doors anymore. All over the country we see these kinds of changes. What impact has this on the composition of our population? Well, from the census, you can divide us into Hispanics and non-Hispanics based on self-identification. And if you're non-Hispanic, you can racially identify as white, black, American Indian, Alaska Native, Asian, Native Hawaiian, 2 or more races. What you will see is we added 27 million people to our population during the first decade of the new millennium. About 15.2 million of them were Hispanic. Growth rate about 43%. Go up, you see the non-Hispanic population only grew by about 4.9%, and the non-Hispanic white population grew by 1.2%. Where's the growth coming from in America? It's all of those people of color where you get the double-digit growth. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about the browning of America. It's where the source of growth is going to come from in the change period. Now, undergirding this browning of America is a profound change in marriage patterns, something we call marrying out is in. This means there's an increasing tendency for you to marry someone who is of a different racial and ethnic group than yourself. Well, who's doing all this hooking up? The out-marriage rate doubled between newly married couples between 1980 and 2008 and went from 3 to 8% of all currently married. Who are these folks? About 41% of the out-marriages among Hispanics and whites. About 15% of it, Asians and whites out-marry. In about 16% of the cases, both groups are non-white, black, Asian, Asian, Hispanic. And then there's this group of other, I don't know who the heck they are, but they hooking up and they ain't hooking up with anybody that looks like them. Note that the black-white share is only about 11%. This is changing the complexion of our community apropos this browning of America notion. And the key to it is, if you look at the 2 or more race category, grew by about 30%. It's all changing the complexion of our society. That's what we mean by the browning of America. Now, what's interesting about all of this stuff is undergirding the browning of America is this profound redistribution trend that we find ourselves in the midst of. A profound shift in the population from the Northeast and the Midwest to the West and the South. The South rises again. Ladies and gentlemen, if you look at the data very carefully, what you will see until the 1970s for the 20th century, the South was the place to leave. I grew up in North Carolina, and I went to school in the heyday of school segregation and the like. I remember playing football with the KKK, marching outside the stadium, all of that. I couldn't wait to get out of North Carolina. I graduated from college in 1975, bought a one-way ticket out. So I'm out of here, ain't never coming back. Because the South was economically backwards. It wasn't racially a nice place to be. Only captured about 30% of net population growth until the 1970s. And then something profound happened. The South went from the place to leave to being the place to be. Ladies and gentlemen, we went from a region where we speak 2 languages, English and bad English, to one where we speak more than 250 different languages. And every decade since 1970, the South has captured about half of net national population growth in this country. Look at it. Including the first decade of the new millennium, 27 million people added to our population, 14.3 million of them in the South. Growth rate of a 14.5%. The second most rapidly growing region was the West region of the country. Slow growth in the Northeast and the Midwest. This profound redistribution trend of population. What share of growth? 53% of net growth in the South, 32% out West. This is this redistribution, this driving kind of change that we find ourselves in the midst of. Why is it happening? It's all about migration and it's all about immigration. Look at it. South, the only region where everybody was moving to in larger numbers than they were leaving. Talk about all migrants, talk about African Americans, talk about Hispanics, talk about the elderly, the foreign-born. Everybody headed south in larger numbers than they were leaving. Can't say that about the West. The West was losing Hispanics, was losing the elderly. Go to the Midwest, the only group that were moving there in larger numbers than were leaving were the elderly. And this is a news flash. This last cold spell, they the hell out of there too. And the Northeast is kind of like, when the last person leaves, please turn off the lights if they're still on and end up there. You can actually see, I know in Georgia it's a lot like North Carolina, you can see this movement by paying attention to license tags. Not when you're driving, but when you're in the parking lot. You see all those snowboards headed where? South. It's a profound kind of redistribution in population. But I lied to you. I said it was the South. It's really not the South. It's 4 states in the South where this is going on. It's about Texas. It's about Florida. It's about Georgia and North Carolina. Those 4 states captured 71% of that net growth. The other southern states combined only about 29%. So where's the action for the issues you're talking about? You know where they are, those various states there. Now, I stopped at 2008 purposely because we had something called a Great Recession. The question is, what impact did it have on migration, immigration behavior? Answer, a slowdown. Not a shift in the trajectory, but a slowdown. Went from a net gain of about 655,000 people 2004 to 2007 to about 396,000 2007, 2010. But look at Florida. Florida actually flipped. Florida went from a magnet to what? An exporter. Why would that be the case? Well, a lot of those retirees that moved to Florida with nice portfolios, what happened to their portfolios? They went further south. I don't have time to show you, but I have data that says they are back in the workforce. They're called the newly unretired. So they're back in the workforce. And some people in Florida, as they age to the level that they needed caregiving experiences, what did their caregivers say? We're not coming there. You got to come to where we are because of the economy. Now, this is a temporary phenomenon, but it's flipped. Understand that migration and immigration tied to the business cycle. Slow down in international migration because we want to build a wall around the country and keep everybody out. Now, what's happened? So I call it the browning of America. We added 27 million people to our population. What share of them were non-white? The answer is 92% of them were non-white, and about 56% of them were white, Hispanic. That's the browning of America. That's what's going to. You see it for the various states and regions. We don't have time to talk about all of that. Now, what's happened since 2010? We added another 6.8 million people to our population. Same trend, 3.5 million of them in the South. Second largest group in the West. Slow growth in the Northeast and the Midwest. 52% of that growth, same trend. The only difference is I got to add Virginia to this magnet states. Georgia, Florida, Texas, North Carolina, and Virginia, 77% of the growth concentrated in those 4 states. So you're talking about an uneven pattern of growth and change. So it's all about this that undergirds this kind of linguistic thing we've been talking about. It's all immigration driven. And so you ask the question, this is the absolute number and percent of U.S. households in which no one over age 14 speaks English in 2012. About 4.5% of all households, of about 5.2 million households, fit that bill where no one over 14 speaks English. And what I have here is you see them across the regions there. And what language is dominant? About 61% of those folks speak Spanish, and about 20% speak Asian language, some Asian language and the like. Consistent with the immigration patterns that we've been talking about, you can look at the data across the regions there, and you begin to see it's a bit uneven, but you see the change and what undergirds the kind of changes we're talking about. What about the age distribution? Now we're talking about population. That was households who speak a language other than English at home. Now this is anybody who speaks a language other than English, not just linguistically challenged. So about 61 million people. You see about 20% of those people are between the ages of 5 and 17. That's pretty uniform across regions. You see the bulk of them are 18 to 64, as you would say. About 10% of them are 65 plus. How about the poverty status? About 20% of them have incomes below the poverty level. These people who have speak a language other than English. It's about half and half people with high school diploma or less, with some college or more in terms of the distribution of these people. That's the 25 to first population. And about 55% of them are foreign-born, 44% of them native-born, 24% naturalized citizens, about a third, 31%, who are not citizens in a diverse set of characteristics. The linguistically challenged, the ASC asked 2 questions. Do you speak, how many people don't speak English very well, and how many people don't speak it at all? I've combined those 2 groups and said that's the real linguistically challenged population. This is the total population of about 13 million people. You see the age structure of those folk who are linguistically challenged, either because they don't speak English very well or they don't speak it at all. And these are the children, the linguistic challenged few, about 786,000 of them. Most of them speak Spanish, as you can see. About 13% of them speak some Asian language. And you look across the categories and you begin to see some uneven distribution across regions that we can talk about later. It's key takeaways. Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about an unprecedented browning of America, color adjustment in our population. In 2005, 67% of our population was non-Hispanic white. 10 years earlier, it was 74%. We now think by 2050, the population is going to drop, white population below 50% at about 47% of growth. You see what real growth is among Hispanics, Asians, and the like. This is what people don't get in the immigration debate, ladies and gentlemen. You have to understand that immigration and migration are age-selective processes. What does that mean? Far more young people migrate and immigrate than older people. There's one more part of that key to that story. Don't repeat this because you could lose your job if you do. In fact, I'm denying I say this before I say it. Young people are more likely to have children than old folk. You put those two things together, ladies and gentlemen, it has an impact on your age structure. Look at it. Median age of the U.S. population, 2009, 37. Half of us older than that, half of us younger than that. Somebody tell me what the median age of a Hispanic in America is. 27. Now, how many of y'all heard that Hispanics are a burden on the healthcare system? Heard that? What kind of major health problem do you have when your median age is 27? Before you answer that, somebody tell me what the median age of a non-Hispanic white is in America. 40 what? What kind of health problem do you have when you get in your 40s? I ain't got all day. Katie's got to present. One of them is acute. When you're young, you stick your finger in the lawnmower, you have to go get it glued back on. When you're in your 40s, what kind of health conditions do you have? Chronic. Which one costs the most? Chronic. I know up front and close. I lost my wife to cancer at 48 years old. Last 6 months of life, her treatment, $5,000 a week. And you say, well, the Hispanics have a whole lot of children. Ladies and gentlemen, you need a lot of babies before you get to one cancer treatment. See, this stuff makes no sense when people start being anti-immigrant. Now, ladies, let me talk to you all real quick. There's something in demography called completed fertility. Okay? I'm not going to tell you the big theory. Let me just tell you what it's about in popular terms. It's when you tell your boo, go take out the trash. Ain't nothing else happening here. Okay? Completed fertility for women occurs between the ages of 40 and 44. Okay? What does that mean? There's a precipitous drop-off in what? Fertility. What's the median age of a non-Hispanic white female in America? 43. Now look at all those women of color below there. That's your fertility gap. 10 to 20-year gap. What are the children going to look like? See, you can't debate the bucket of a child born today, 5 years from now, they're knocking on your door in about 250 different languages. That's the fertility gap. We don't get it. We don't get it. There's something called the total fertility rate. If you're in a relationship, two people, you need to have 2.1 kids to replace yourself. Don't ask me about the 0.1. You just got to be rocking and rolling. Okay. If you need 2.1 kids to replace yourself, who's replacing themselves in America? Look at it. Hispanics and what? Blacks. The non-Hispanic white population has had a total fertility rate of 1.9 for 2 decades. Now, that means the average white family has 1.9 kids. Now, I don't know how you get 0.9 of a kid. I taught a few of them at Chapel Hill. But remember, you need 2.1 kids to replace yours. See, this age structure has an impact on fertility, and you need to understand what's going to happen, and we need everybody to understand. We see the impact already. 66% of all births in America in 1990 were to non-Hispanic white families. That dropped to 50% by 2008. For the first time in history, white births dropped below 50% in 2011. It's unlikely to go the other direction. Why? Because of differences in the age structure and the like. Just look at North Carolina. We added close to 160,000 new students to our population, school-age population between 2000 and 2009. 96,000 of them were what? Hispanic, and 51,000 of them were what? Black. note that the white share actually dropped. Now, some of that's because white families sent their kids to private schools, but a lot of it is what? Declining fertility. Understand, there's nothing more predictable than demography. 60% of all the growth was the Hispanic, 92% of it black and brown. That's the browning of America that we've been talking about. Now, we have seen a fundamental shift in immigration patterns. Between 2000 and 2009, we had a heck of a lot of immigration. The yellow is from Latin America. But since 2010, we've seen this profound shift, drop off in immigration from Latin America, and a very sharp increase in immigration from Asia. Part of that is the flow of unauthorized immigrants is way down, almost at zero, but we've also shifted our emphasis in who we allow to come into America, because what we want is high-tech immigrants coming in. If you got something that start a business, or you want to pay $500,000 to come, we'll open the door like Tom Bodett at Motel 6 and leave the light on for you in this country to transform. So we've seen this fundamental shift, and I think it has some implications for linguistic diversity down the road, because a lot of the Asian immigrants who come, they're taught in English in their homelands and a whole series of other things, something to talk about a little bit later. I don't have time to talk about this, but I just want, we've been doing this economic impact of immigrants, because everybody say immigrants cost more than they contribute. This is the model we use. We've done about 4 studies. This is the one we just finished in North Carolina. We just released it. If you look at immigrants in North Carolina, and you look at their consumer expenditures and their tax contributions versus the cost of essential services, K-12 education, healthcare, and corrections, basically, for every dollar North Carolina spends for K-12 education, healthcare, and corrections in North Carolina, they get about $10 back in business revenue and taxes. For Hispanics, they get about $6 back. Doesn't sound like a cost to me. Now, we can talk about that later. Y'all can look at the report. I don't have time to develop. Down in international migration, immigrants, we need them, ladies and gentlemen. They boost economic growth and prosperity. And whenever you have a new immigrant group come into your community, they create additional jobs in your community. And they're not low-wage jobs. They create professional jobs. You don't believe it? Go to your yellow pages and look under the label attorneys and tell me why you need an immigrant attorney if you don't have immigrants. And don't tell me an immigration attorney is a low-wage worker. It's not. They create good jobs in the community. They contribute to innovation. They fill 3D jobs. You don't know what 3D jobs are? Difficult, dirty, and dangerous. You don't like to do them. Yeah. Increase tax revenue, and they are an antidote to an aging native-born population. That silver tsunami, ladies and gentlemen, is about the boomer population. Those of us who were born between 1946 and 1964, there are 80 million of us. On July 1st of 2011, the first baby boomer born in America turned 65 and became eligible for what? Everything. Over the next 20 years, every day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, we boomers will be turning 65 to the tune of 8,000 per day. Somebody's got to replace them. And the average person turning 65 today is going to live another 18.7 years. We now think living to 100 on a routine basis is well within reach. Ladies and gentlemen, if you got declining fertility on the one hand, aging on the other hand, who's going to pay the bills? And if you can't go home and fix it, you can't go home and fix it because you're too old. If you can't reproduce it, how do you get it? Got to import it. Let me leave you with one thought, because I think the challenge of all the work that you all are doing, this important work that you're doing, here's something that keeps me up at night. The red counties on this map are racial generation gap counties. In these counties, the adult voting age population is comprised of a predominantly white, empty nester citizenry. But the school age population is predominantly minority. What kind of support for public education you think you get there? That's the ain't got no dog in the fight crowd. My children are out of school. I don't need to be bothered with that. What are they concerned with? Retirement amenities, crime and safety, and all of that. Gold counties are minority counties. Adult voting age population minority, school age population minority. Lots of interest in education. What's missing? Money there. They're low wealth counties. The white space, the majority of those counties are majority counties. The adult voting age population is predominantly white, school age population is predominantly white. But in those districts, about a third of the kids are kids of color. But if you peer beneath the veneer, what you will see is that most of the kids of color are either attending racially isolated schools within those districts or within the fancy districts. They are where? On the non-academic prep tracks. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, the new majority, kids of color, are between a rock and a hard place through no fault of their own. I know of no society in history where you exclude the majority and you have a civil society. When you at your book clubs, your whiskey drinking hole, wherever you are, and people tell you that they don't have a dog in the K-12 education fight, tell them, yes, they do. It's called the future competitiveness of our nation. You leave these kids out, you don't deal with the linguistic issues we're talking about here, we can't compete in the global marketplace of the 21st century. Plain and simple. I don't talk in social or moral terms anymore because I don't think anybody moved by their appeal. But if you start talking about this is a competitiveness issue, people start understanding. I'm sorry I went over my time, but that's what I had to say. Now I got to walk back to North Carolina. I'm sorry, Katie.